Well, hello and welcome to this lesson on preaching and specifically the subject of preaching Old Testament narratives. We might, if we have time, talk about a New Testament narrative as well, but the primary focus of this study is preaching Old Testament narratives. I hear pastors tell me all of the time that they find it very difficult to preach the stories of the Old Testament. And yet, so much of the Bible is narrative. In fact, approximately 70% of all the Bible, Old and New Testament, is couched in narrative form. And so, one of the things we must learn to do if we are to be effective as preachers is learn how to preach Old Testament narratives. We must learn how to improve the technique of preaching Old Testament narratives, and that includes understanding what is a narrative, how narratives function, and the approach that needs to be taken in sermon preparation with respect to preaching Old Testament narratives. Now, there are a number of things that I want to say today on this particular subject in hopes that it will be helpful to you in developing your own skills and technique in preaching Old Testament narratives. But let's begin first with what I would call guidelines for interpreting the narrative of the Old Testament. You can find this material in lots of different resources, books on the subject of preaching narrative from the Old Testament. And some of these resources I will be giving to you later in this lesson. But guideline number one is identify the narrative, the pericope. Where does the narrative begin and where does it end? And then determine that your sermon will cover that full narrative. It is unwise, in my opinion, to preach on a narrative text and take only half of it, or a third of it, or three-fourths of it, or do the first half or not the second half, or even to preach a two-part sermon on a longer narrative. I think all of that is probably less than ideal. Better would be to determine the narrative unit, the full story from beginning to end, and then preach on that text. Now, for example, throughout our study today, we'll talk about or use as our example text Genesis 22, 1 through 19. That is the story of Abraham and Isaac. When God came to Abraham and said, Abraham, take your son and sacrifice him to me. So that text is a narrative. And the narrative begins in verse 1 and ends in verse 19. And so if you were preaching that text, you would preach the full 19 verses which contain the story. So the first thing you want to do is be sure and identify the boundary of the story, the boundary of the narrative. The second thing you want to do in preparing to preach on narratives is look at the immediate context and the broader context. When it comes to preaching Genesis 22, for example, notice what you have in verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham. Now, those three words, after these things, are very important because basically you cannot fully understand what God is doing and what the author of Genesis, Moses, is doing in telling this story unless you know the backstory. The backstory begins in Genesis 12:1 and then runs through Genesis 22. And it's the story of God's promise to Abraham that he would give him a son, give him a seed, that he would be a blessing to all of the nations. And then the ins and outs and ups and downs of Abraham and Sarah's experience as they journey toward the promised land that God told them to go to, as they journey toward that land. And finally, the birth of Isaac occurs, and then Isaac grows to be a teenager, and all things that occur prior to Genesis 22 impact the story contextually. So you'd want to know that after these things, then we read what happens in Genesis 22. So we want to be careful to look at the context, the immediate context, but also we want to look at the broad context. Well, then we want to take a look at the narrative itself and recognize that narratives have certain characteristics. Narratives are contain plot. They contain setting. A narrative contains characters. Most narratives have dialogue. Most narratives express a rising tension or a problem that needs to be addressed, that comes to a climax, and then there is a resolution. All of these, by the way, are found in the 19 verses of Genesis chapter 22 and the story of Abraham and Isaac. So we want to recognize these key things that go into and that compose a narrative, because in preparing a sermon on a narrative text, you will want to look at each one of those. So the first thing then that you want to do as you actually enter into the narrative is to look at the scenes in a narrative. Narratives are different than the letters of the New Testament. Those are two different kinds of genres. The letters of the New Testament have points. You go through the letters of the New Testament, and there are logical relationships that are there, and maybe there are 2 or 3 or 4 main points that are being communicated in a given paragraph. But a narrative is different. A narrative doesn't have points like you would have in a sermon on the letters of the New Testament. Narratives are composed of scenes. And so in any given narrative, you have scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, etc. And when you are doing a sermon, preparing a sermon on the narratives, any narrative unit of Scripture, what you want to do is identify the scenes. And then the development of the scenes becomes the outline or the backbone or the structure of your sermon. Now, let's just take a look right here in Genesis 22. You might want to have your Bibles open if you can. And let's see if we can determine how many scenes are present. All right. Notice in 22, verses 1 and 2 go together. We read there that God tests Abraham by calling him, and Abraham says, "Here I am." And then God says, "Take your son and sacrifice him to me." Notice then verses 1 and 2 go together, but when we come to verse 3 in the narrative, we read, "So Abraham got up early in the morning." So now the scene number 2 is beginning, because now we have a chronological time frame where on the next day, Abraham begins the process of obeying God. And so the first scene is verses 1 and 2. It sets the stage. Scene number 2 begins in verse 3. And actually, that verse 3 alone is a scene. Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. Now look at verse 4. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked. So now here is a new scene. Chronologically, you see, the 3rd day, a new day, the time frame has shifted. So therefore, scene 2 is verse 3, and verse 4 begins scene number 3. And in verse 4, or scene number 3, actually goes through verse 6. So verses 4, 5, and 6 compose the 3rd scene in the narrative. So Abraham looked up and he saw the place, and he said to his young men, "Stay here. The boy and I will go to worship." Abraham took the wood for the offering, laid it on his son Isaac, and in his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked on together. Now mark that last phrase, that last clause. The 2 of them walked on together. You're going to see that again in just a moment. So now notice verses 4 through 6 are a unit. They go together. It's a scene, right? So you've got a scene in 4 through 6. Then verse 7 introduces dialogue into the narrative. Then Isaac spoke to his father and said, and then Abraham replies to his son. So now notice then that scene number 4 is verses 7 and 8. You have scene 4, verses 7 and 8. You have dialogue. You have Isaac's question, and you have Abraham's answer. So scene 4 is found in verses 7 and 8. Notice how verse 8 ends. Then the two of them walked on together. An exact repetition of the very words that are found at the end of the previous scene. So this is another signal now that this scene is ending and a new scene will begin. So notice in verse 9, you have the introduction of scene number 5, when they arrived at the place that God had told them about. So you see there's a shift in the narrative. Now we're moving to a new scene. They have arrived at Mount Moriah. And then we are told the things that Abraham does. So Abraham builds the altar. He arranges the wood. He binds his son Isaac. He places him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out and he took the knife to kill his son. So now notice this is a scene right here. Verses 9 and 10 go together. Preparation is being made. And in these verses, we are drawn to the edge of our seat in the story because we are wondering, is Abraham going to follow through and fulfill God's command and kill his son Isaac? So you see the rising tension is coming in the narrative, and this is typical of a good story. There is the rising tension that is there. Then verse 11 begins with the word but. So now we're in a new scene here. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. So now we're in a new scene. The angel of God is intervening with the action. And so the angel calls, Abraham responds. And then verse 12, you have the words of the angel. Don't kill that boy. I don't want you to do that. Now I know that you follow me fully and that you will obey me completely. Then we're told in verse 13, after the angel completed his speech, Abraham looks up, he sees that ram caught in the thicket by his horns. He goes to the ram and offers the ram in the place of his son. And Abraham named that place, the Lord will provide. So today it's still called that. It will be provided on the Lord's mountain. So now we see that verses 11 through 14 go together and comprise a scene. So this is the next scene. Scene number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Scene number 6. All right, look at verse 15, the beginning of scene number 7. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven. So now the dialogue continues, but there's a shift. The previous dialogue is concluded, but now there is a new dialogue. The angel of the Lord calls to Abraham and says, and here God speaks directly to Abraham all the way through verse 18. And this is really the conclusion of the story in many ways. It is the denouement, as the French refer to it, the resolution of the tension and the outcome of the story. And here is scene number 7, verses 15 through 18. And then finally comes the closure, verse 19, which is now we're back to the narrator telling the story and bringing us to a conclusion. So verse 19 is really scene 8, the final scene. Abraham went back to his young men. They got up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham settled in Beersheba. Now, here's the conclusion, right? This is the final scene. So depending on whether you want to take the narrator's comment as a final scene, or if you'd rather keep 7 scenes and make the narrator's comment in verse 19 the actual conclusion, you can do that either way. But the point is, here you have a narrative that unfolds in scenes. Now, in preaching narratives, this is crucial. You've got to go through the narrative, mark the scenes, because those scenes you will preach the narrative as it develops in chronological order, and you will develop your sermon structure according to the scenes. That is a crucial part of preaching an Old Testament narrative. Now, the next thing you do, and in the process of looking at the scenes, you are going to analyze the plot, because there is a plot. That's the whole point of a story. You don't have a story unless you have a plot. Every story has a plot line. Some plot lines are simple. Some plot lines are complex. And so every narrative has a plot line, and what you're going to do is analyze the plot line. You're going to watch the action as it moves from start to climax, from start to finish. What in the world is taking place here? That will basically give you some sense of the beginning, middle, and end of a narrative. And you want to think about a narrative in that way. You want to think about the three parts here of a story. You've got a beginning, you've got the middle, which may usually be the longest part, and then you have the ending. And so therefore, analyzing the plot of the passage is necessary before you construct your sermon. All right. Another factor here, another step you want to take is determine the point of view of the narrative, right? So what is the narrator doing with this text? What is the point of view that the narrator is expressing? Is the point of view the narrator himself? Is the point of view God? Is the point of view Abraham? What is the point of view that's taking place? So where does the text come to a focal point so that the subject of the text, and therefore the title of your message, whatever you choose, can be made clear? It's this kind of analyzing of the plot and determining the point of view that will help you to do these things when you write your sermon. Now, the next thing that you're going to carefully look at is the dialogue. This text has dialogue. You have dialogue between God and Abraham. You have dialogue that goes on between Abraham and Isaac. You have dialogue with Abraham and the angel of the Lord that is probably a Christophany, may not be, but could be. But either way, you have again at the end God's dialogue with Abraham, and so you want to look at that dialogue. Look at what is stated in that dialogue. What are the special statements or figures of speech that are used? What's taking place in that dialogue? Dialogue here in Abraham's story of Genesis 22 is very important. In fact, notice the places in Genesis 22 where God addresses Abraham, and Abraham answers God by saying, "Here I am." 3 words in English, 1 word in Hebrew, Hineni. And that's actually very important part of the structure of the story, because 3 times Abraham says, "Here I am." So you want to look at the dialogue, who speaks to whom, what is said, how is it said, etc. These are the kinds of things that are crucial for preparing a good sermon on a narrative of the Old Testament. Also, look at how the scenes are related to each other in the entire narrative. How are they connected? What are the connectors that move you from scene 1, scene 2, scene 3? And then you want to make use of that in your sermon as you develop that. Also, another step to take, or another principle to follow in preaching Old Testament narratives, is note whatever stylistic devices are used in order to determine the proper emphasis that the narrator is making. What is the proper characterization that's there? These aspects are very, very important when it comes to preaching narratives. Now, let me introduce you to one of the books that I highly recommend on preaching Old Testament narratives. It's a book by Christopher Wright. Christopher Wright, and the title is How to Preach and Teach the Old Testament for All It Is Worth. How to Preach and to Teach the Old Testament from All It Is Worth, written by Christopher Wright. This book is one of the most helpful books in preaching the Old Testament. I want to encourage you to add that book to your library because it will help you in preparing sermons on the narratives of the Old Testament. 2 of his chapters in this sermon I think are very important, and I want to survey them for you in terms of from the table of contents. For example, his chapter number 7 says that when you get ready to preach and teach Old, Old Testament narratives, there are five questions you want to ask. And I've used this myself as well for many years. I think this is exactly right. It's kind of Rudyard Kipling's, famous men who have helped him, who, what, when, where, how, and why. And so basically Wright takes those and he says, these are the five questions you want to ask. When and where is this story taking place? That's the question of the setting of the story. When and where is it taking place? That's a crucial part of preparing narrative sermons. Number two, what and how is it taking place? This has to do with the plot. What and how is the story taking place? That's the plot. Then the question of who. Who is in the story? Who are the characters that make up the story? So you want to make sure you do good character analysis and answer the question of who. Then the question of why. Why the narrative? Now, this one gets a little bit tricky because many of the stories of the Bible do not give you a direct, overt statement as to their purpose. Why are they there? Sometimes a narrator will do that. Sometimes the narrator will either give you a hint or will directly state the answer to the question, why? But not always. In fact, usually that will not occur. You have to discern what is the author's purpose? What's he doing with this story? But that's a very important question before you preach, because you've got to know the answer to the question of why. Then finally, the question of so what? So what? This has to do with the reader. What's the importance of this story for the audience, for the readers? And therefore, you've got to make a decision about how to connect the so what, how to answer the question, so what, so that your readers understand, or your listeners in your sermon understand what is happening in this story. So these are very helpful, and that's a very helpful chapter. It's only about a 20-page chapter, 5 questions to ask when preaching and teaching Old Testament stories in Christopher Wright's book, How to Preach and Teach the Old Testament for All It Is Worth. But then in his chapter 8, he gives us an opportunity to speak practically about 7 dangers to avoid when preaching and teaching Old Testament stories. There are some dangers to avoid. Let me just summarize them as I list them from what he says about them right here. Dangers to avoid when you are preaching Old Testament stories. Number 1, don't turn the story into moral principles. In other words, don't moralize. One of the dangers of preaching stories in the Bible is to moralize. Now, there are sometimes morals in the story, either overtly or covertly, that are there that can be discerned. But the point is, you don't want to moralize. That's a hermeneutical mistake, or hermeneutical problem, is just to simply draw a moral out of this story. Now, there may be a moral in the story, right? But you want to make sure that you don't turn that story into a moral principle or 3 moral principles or whatever. Number 2 warning he gives us, danger. Don't turn the story into a few spiritual truths. Now, there are spiritual truths that are found in the stories, but you want to be careful that you're not approaching narrative for the purpose of distilling just spiritual truth out of it. Now, don't misunderstand me. You need to communicate spiritual truth, but the story is not there only as a kernel from which we want to extract the meat and then throw away the kernel. No, the story is there and it's important. And in the story, we do not want to turn it into just a few spiritual truths. Avoid that danger. Number 3, don't look for fanciful hidden meanings in the story. Okay, here is where we don't allegorize, right? You don't want to allegorize. Now, there are a few times when the biblical writers are engaged in giving an allegory. But you do not want to allegorize. Let's not do that. Don't allegorize, because allegorization is again a hermeneutical problem. We don't want to do it. So let's make sure that we don't fall into the trap of allegorizing, right? We don't want to do that. Now, let me give you an example. Do you remember over there in the Old Testament when Elisha and his men are involved in the school of the prophets, and they're building the quarters where the school of the prophets are going to live, and they're out there and they're cutting down the trees, and one of the members of the school of the prophets has a borrowed axe, and you remember that he's cutting his tree, and suddenly the axe head flies off into the pond, into the water, and sinks, and the man is distraught because an axe is a valuable tool and an expensive tool, and it was borrowed. And you don't just have a lot of axes lying around. And so now this axe is useless because the axe head has flown off into the water. Well, what does Elisha do? Well, he performs a miracle. And he cuts a stick of wood off of the tree, goes out to the water, holds it out over the water, and God performs a miracle. The water, or the iron axe head at the bottom of the water, rises to the top, and he retrieves his axe head. And so here's a miracle. Now, this is an odd and unusual miracle, and we wonder, why is this one in the Bible, and what is God saying, and all of that? Well, you'll have to process that when you preach on that text someday. But here's what I want you to notice. How many sermons have I heard or read in church history on that text? And the preacher waxes eloquent and says something like this. And so the prophet cut the stick, the wood from the tree, and that wood is the cross of Jesus. No, it's not. It's a stick of wood. It's not the cross. That is an example of gross allegorization. And that's exactly the danger of preaching Old Testament narratives. Don't allegorize things. Don't take David's 5 stones that he chose to put in his pouch as ammunition and make those 5 stones mean, each one means some kind of something that you allegorize in the Christian life. David took the stone of faith. David took the stone of courage. No, he didn't. That's allegorization. You're missing the point of the text and mispreaching the text when you do stuff like that. So quit it. Don't do it. And listen to the principle, the danger. Don't look for fanciful, hidden meanings in the story. All right. A fourth danger. Don't flatten the story into doctrinal sermon points. In other words, don't structure your sermon. Take the story and then determine what are the doctrines that are being taught here. And then the structure of the sermon and the outline of the sermon is placed in doctrinal sermon points. That's not usually the best way to preach a narrative. So avoid flattening the story into doctrinal points. Number 5, don't get bogged down in difficulties and details. Now, some narratives have difficulties and some are very detailed. Now, if you don't handle those details, let's start with them. If you don't handle those details carefully, you will lose your people in the weeds of the story. You'll get lost in the weeds, and they're following you. They're going to get lost in the weeds. And so don't do that. Don't get bogged down in the details. Now, don't ignore the details. The details are significant. There's a reason. The Bible is the inspired word of God, and if there are details given, there's a reason why they are given. But just don't get bogged down in all the details and try to explain every little nuance, every nook and cranny, and every little detail, because then you're going to miss the forest for the trees. You're going to miss the big picture. You don't want to do that. Don't get bogged down in the details. Also, don't get bogged down in the difficulties that are there. You know, some texts have some difficulties in terms of interpretation. Genesis 6, the sons of God and the daughters of men. Oh my goodness. And so if you're preaching that, you don't want to spend 25 minutes giving a lecture to the congregation of all the possible views and the pros and cons of all the possible views and what the Hebrew says here and what the Akkadian said over there. I mean, no, you don't want to get into all of that, because that is pressing the difficulties too far. So beware here. Don't get bogged down in difficulties and in details. Number 6, don't create wrong expectations. Don't tell the story. Don't work through the narrative, creating unrealistic or unnecessary expectations, or even the wrong expectations of what the story is about, what the story will do, what this means for you. So don't create wrong expectations. And number 7, don't subvert the gospel. In your preaching here, don't forget it's an Old Testament text, but you are still preaching the gospel. You're still looking at how God is communicating the gospel through this Old Testament text. Don't subvert it. Be sure and understand what's the role of Christ. Where does Jesus fit into this story? Does he fit into the story in some prophetic way? Is this a messianic prophecy somewhere? Or does he fit into the story in a typological way? Is there typology here? Or does he fit into the story in terms of a principled way? Is there some principle that points to Christ in the New Testament? All of these kinds of questions you have to think through when it comes to looking into your narrative. Now, we've already talked about plot, character, setting, point of view, but I want to speak to you about a summary list of features to look at, to examine when it comes to Old Testament narratives. Now, I'm deriving these from another book that I want to recommend to you. Stephen Mathewson's book entitled The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narrative. Be sure and get the second edition, The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narrative. I've used this as a textbook in my teaching of preaching many times through the years, and I found it to be one of the most helpful books on preaching Old Testament narrative. This is worth adding to your library. Again, Stephen Mathewson, The Art of Preaching Old Testament Narrative. Now, in his book, he has a summary list, or I've summarized these from preaching Old Testament text. So here's what he says. Number 1, be sure and study and look at the plot, right? So what is the plot? What's the plot line? What is the main storyline? And then what is the background storyline? What's the main line, the foreground, and what's the background? Developing the plot, learning to follow the plot in the story, and to identify what we call the foreground of the plot, the mainline information, and the background of the plot, the subsidiary information. Being able to properly see those, categorize those, that is crucial. What about marked text? Marked text, spot sections where clusters of unusual terms appear, rare forms, or whatever might slow down the reader a little bit. Take a look at that. Also, take a look at structure that is involved, patterns. For example, is there an example of parallelism? Do you find the author saying something A, B, A, B? That's a form of parallelism. Or A, B, and then B, A. That's a form of parallelism, by the way, called chiasm. It's a pattern or style of parallelism. Many times those kinds of things mark the boundaries of a narrative or key turning points in the narrative. So you want to take a look at marked text. You want to take a look at parallel structures that are developed in the text. Look at the plot stages. What is happening in terms of the plot? The exposition, the crisis, resolution, and conclusion. Watch that. Look for patterns or motifs that are there. Is this comedy? Is it tragedy? What kind of story is being told here? And so watch for things like that. Also, and this one's crucial, watch for key repetition. You want to look for key words that are repeated, key phrases that are repeated. In the Genesis 22 story, you're going to find that. God speaks to Abraham. Abraham says, "Here I am." Then you get the repetition, and the two of them walked on together, and the two of them walked on together. And then, of course, you come to the end. Abraham went back with to the young men, and they got up and went together. There's that word together, to Beersheba. These are repetitions that are important. They're placed there by the author. They are conveying something that's very, very important. So watch repetition, repetition of key words, repetition of names or pronouns. Those kinds of things can be important. Also, time and place. What is the narrative time and place? What's happening? How long are these events taking? In the Genesis story, it's a matter of you got a 1 day something, and then there's the next morning, and then there's a 3 day journey, and then they arrive. Look at the time. Look at the pace that's developed there. These are important aspects of looking at plot. Now, I would also say, look at the verb tenses in each scene. Is the author developing this story in using predominantly present tense verbs? Is he using past tense verbs? When is there a tense shift? What if we get several present tense verbs and then all of a sudden we get a perfect tense verb? That is significant. That kind of change or shift is noteworthy. So look at the verbal structure. Remember, verbs are the load-bearing walls of every text. You can take away a noun or an adjective here and there and still understand what's going on. But if you remove too many verbs, the roof collapses because you cannot understand what's happening. Verbs are the load-bearing walls. That's certainly true of Hebrew and Greek. It's true of narratives, whether Old or New Testament. Look carefully at your verbs. Chart those verbs. Determine what's happening, how the plot line is being furthered by the choice of verbs that are there. All right, let's shift to characters. We go from plot to characters. We want to identify the characters. Now, you want to identify them not only as to who they are, but what is their function? Is this character a protagonist? Is that character an antagonist? Is that character a foil? Is this character major or is this character minor? Take the story again at Genesis 22. God is, of course, the major character, and then Abraham is the major character. Isaac is somewhere less of a character than is Abraham, because the point of Genesis 22 is Abraham's obedience to God. That's the big point. But Isaac is still a fairly significant character. Less significant in the story are the servants. They're not named, they don't talk, they're there, but they are less significant. We would call them minor characters. The ram is a character, but probably not considered the major character, though the ram takes the place of Isaac, but the ram is a more of a secondary character in one sense of the story. So you want to identify the characters. You want to look at direct descriptions of characters. What is being said about them? How are they described? Are they described as old or young? Are they described as nice or mean? How are they described? Look carefully at direct descriptions of those characters. Number 3, look at their behavior. Observe their actions for insight into their personalities. What are they doing? And so character activity is crucial. In the New Testament, in the Gospels, I love looking at what is stated about the character of the 12 disciples because they're always doing something or saying something, sometimes something that's good, sometimes something that's bad, sometimes something that you as the reader just want to say, are you guys, what's wrong with you 12 guys? Are you stupid or something? I mean, looking at how the characters of the 12 disciples are developed in the Gospels is a fascinating study. Number next, look at their names. Notice the significance behind any names of characters. Of course, Isaac, Yitzhak in Hebrew, means laughter. And we know the backstory of how Isaac came to be given by God miraculously to Abraham and Sarah when they were beyond childbearing years and when Sarah was barren. And yet God performed a miracle and made it possible for Abraham and Sarah to conceive, and they named him Yitzhak, laughter, because remember, Sarah laughed behind the tent flap when the angel of the Lord spoke to Abraham, and Sarah didn't believe it. And also, obviously, a young child into the life of this senior adult couple would bring joy. And so there's a good reason why his name is Yitzhak, laughter. But there's no laughing matter in Genesis 22 because God tells Abraham to take his life, take Isaac's life, sacrifice him to me. Oh, my goodness. And so names play a significant role. Abraham's name, remember, he was Abram, and then God changed his name to Abraham, and one little small tittle of the letter change in the Hebrew alphabet, a little breath sound, Abram to Abraham. The name change, the shift from Abram's name that is found there, that's significant. All of these kinds of things, look at the names and determine the significance. Designation, pay attention to how the narrator describes a character. What does he say about a character? And then dialogue. What does the dialogue tell you about the character? What insight into the character do we gain from dialogue? Now, go back to the dialogue of Genesis 22, right? So Isaac says, Dad, we've done this before, but there's something missing. Here's the wood, and we have the fire to start the fire for the sacrificial animal. But where's the animal? There's no animal. Abraham responds to his son, gives an indication of his great faith and trust in God. My son, God will provide for himself a sacrifice. So again, we learn something about Abraham's character in that story. Setting, what's happening intertextually and intertextually in terms of setting. We want to look at the story's temporal setup, the geography, and cultural setting. All three of those, by the way, play a critical role in Genesis 22. You've got a temporal development of a few days. You have a geographical shift from where Abraham is living to the journey to Mount Moriah. That's significant. And then, of course, the cultural setting of sacrifice, pagan sacrifices. And it appears God has succumbed to pagan sacrifices. He asked for Abraham to kill his own son. And yet, of course, that does not happen. And that was never God's intention. But these are the textual setting clues that you want to look at. Check the content of the story's role in the larger narrative of Genesis 22. In the larger narrative of the book of Genesis, and then of the entire Old Testament, and then of the New Testament. And of course, Genesis 22 is crucial in that, from that standpoint. And then you want to take a look at point of view. One word here is the word focalization. Notice whether the perspective is external from our perspective, we're the reader, or is the perspective internal from the character or the narrator? And of course, the perspective of Genesis 22 is predominantly internal, although the opening statement and the concluding statement focalize us, bring us into the story. And then there's the question of the narrator's knowledge. This is called omniscience. We identify narrator statements that give views of information that we could only know that the narrator knows, and we would never know it unless the narrator tells us. That's the omniscient viewpoint, so to speak, of the narrator. We want to look at that point of view. Also, you want to look at irony. determine the occurrence of any verbal irony, any dramatic irony, any situational irony. Well, do you have irony in Genesis 22? Of course you do. You have the irony of God, what we know about God in the first 21 chapters of Genesis. And now God seems to violate his own character when he calls for child sacrifice. And so there is a certain irony here. The irony that we find in this story and many stories is important as you analyze a narrative. Okay, so this is a summary list of features that you want to examine when you are preaching or preparing to preach a narrative. Now, let's shift gears here and talk about plot motifs. This is also information that you can find in Stephen Mathewson's Art of Preaching the Old Testament Narrative. But these 12 plot motifs actually come from Leland Ryken, Ryken, and these are being listed by Stephen Mathewson. But I think this is important to learning how to preach well an Old Testament narrative. So here are Ryken's list of plot motifs. Number one motif, the first motif, would be the quest. This would be called the heroic narrative or something of a hero story. The hero struggles to reach a goal, to overcome the obstacles and go from defeat to success. There are a lot of this motif, lots of this motif you find in the Bible. Joseph in the rest of the book of Genesis. David going through the problems of being hounded by Saul, finally becoming king. Ruth, who is a pagan and yet who becomes one of the greatest women in Israeli history. Abraham himself. All of these are examples of the quest motif. The second motif would be called the death rebirth motif. Here's where the hero endures danger or death and returns to life or to security. And this is maybe Hezekiah, would be an example of that. Joseph would be an example of that. I mean, you think Joseph's never going to make it, but yet somehow he does. This is that death rebirth motif that is found. Of course, all of the life of Jesus is the death rebirth motif because he dies, but then he rises from the dead. And so the entire story of Jesus fits that. A third a third plot motif would be the initiation, in which the character is thrust out of an existing situation and usually a better situation, a good situation, an ideal situation. And then he undergoes a series of ordeals or encounters various forms of hardship for the first time. Examples of that, by the way, one clear example in the Old Testament would be Job. What a story, Job. You talk about that plot motif would be clearly seen in the book of Job. A fourth plot motif is the journey motif. The character encounters danger and experiences growth as they journey from one place to another. This would be true of Abraham. This would be true of Jacob. This would be true of any number of characters found in the Old Testament. A fifth plot motif would be tragedy, or something like the fall from innocence, depicting a decline from bliss to woe, from good to bad. He starts well, but he ends badly. I can think of a number of examples like that in the Old Testament. How about Saul? Saul fits that category. How about Samson? Samson fits that category. And a number of others. Judas fits that category, the category of tragedy. A sixth plot motif is the opposite, comedy. This is a story that begins with prosperity, descends into tragedy, but then rises to a happy ending. And that's what we call, in terms of motif, a comedy. Examples there would be Ruth and Esther. Those would be two great examples of that particular motif. A seventh plot motif is crime and punishment. So you've got an unsympathetic or villainous character undergoes an adverse change of fortune as a punishment for the evil that he has done. How about Ahab and Jezebel in the Old Testament as an example of the crime and punishment motif? Ahab and Jezebel. How about Absalom? Absalom, the son of David, would be another example of that. Number 8 plot motif would be the temptation. Someone becomes a victim of a tempter or a temptress, and they are tempted, and they either succeed or they fail. Of course, Eve in Genesis would be an example of that. Samson and Delilah would be an example of the temptation motif. Another motif, number 9, plot motif, would be the rescue. This is, of course, a motif where somebody is in danger and then they are rescued. Esther, I think, is a great example of that motif. Number 10 plot motif is the suffering servant motif, in which a character undergoes undeserved suffering for ultimately the benefit of other people. Well, Joseph is a clear example of that in the Old Testament. There are many others, but of course, the epic example of that, the pinnacle of examples of that, would be our Lord Jesus Christ, the suffering servant motif. He is the suffering servant in the book of Isaiah, who is revealed in the New Testament as he dies for our sins. An 11th plot motif is the Cinderella motif, or you might call this the rags to riches motif, in which a character overcomes obstacles of ostracism and poverty. So David is an example. Gideon is an example. There are many others that could be mentioned. And finally, the 12th plot motif would be the movement from ignorance to knowledge. The character progresses from ignorance to greater illumination and knowledge. Of course, that's true for many of the characters of the Old Testament, Abraham being one, as we think about Genesis 22. So these are the plot motifs that are there. We want to consider these, think about these as we are preparing to preach on the Old Testament. Now, another thing that makes your preaching effective, I want to mention this briefly, is the role of memorization of key parts of a sermon on the narrative of the Old Testament. You must learn to tell the story well. And there's a certain amount of memory that is required to do that. If you want to preach narratives well, then you've got to, if you want to learn the art of storytelling, you've got to develop some capacity of memorization. For example, sermon introductions. Really to any sermon, but particularly to a narrative sermon, the sermon introduction needs to be memorized as best as possible, much as possible, so it can be presented with clarity, fluidity, and it generates maximum maximum interest up front. One of my sermon introductions was couched in narrative format, a sermon that I preached on Ecclesiastes. And here is how I began my sermon on Ecclesiastes. This is the part of the introduction, not the whole introduction, but I want to show you just the kind of thing that you can creatively develop, but then you have to tell this well. You've got to memorize this to get it right. Across the thick, lush grass of the palace lawn falls the shadows of trees transplanted from distant forests. Fish pools fed by artificial streams are perpetually ruffled with golden scales darting from water cave to water cave. In the royal gardens, beautiful flowers spangle their rainbow colors everywhere. Peacocks strut the walkways. Deer stalk the parkways. In the royal stable, I hear the neighing of 4,000 horses standing in blankets of Tyrian purple, chewing their bits over troughs of gold. In the royal garage are housed 1,400 chariots awaiting the visit of a dignitary to be brought out on parade. Now, I won't tell you the rest of the introduction, but what am I doing there? Well, I am introducing you to the fact that the person I'm talking about is Solomon, who is the author of the book of Ecclesiastes. And I want to demonstrate his unbelievable wealth. And so I studied everything that is stated in the Old Testament about Solomon. How many horses he had, his stables, his gardens, all of that. And then I put that together and prized a story, a narrative introduction to the story of the rise and fall of Solomon in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so I'm trying to paint a picture. Good preaching paints pictures, but in order to do that well, you have to know something about how to construct a narrative and then how to tell it well. And in order to do that, there's a certain amount of memorization that has to be told. So, also keep in mind that when preaching a narrative, fewer illustrations are necessary. You don't need as many illustrations when you're preaching a narrative because a narrative is one big story, it's one big illustration. So, again, go back to Genesis 22, one of the most gripping stories there in all of the Bible. The reading of the text, all to the delivery of the sermon, to the conclusion, the story needs to be told well. And you can do that. And there are textual clues to help you do that. Nor do you need a lot of extra illustrations to illustrate a story. It's already a story. And so you get the rising tension in the story, and then you get the denouement, you get the conclusion, the resolution to the story. So a good narrative text need to be memorized well. But if you're using an illustration in any sermon, narrative or text or otherwise, you still want to learn how to tell that illustration well, and you want to memorize it. That's the best thing you can do. Remember, clarity has to be crafted, and therefore you want your journey with your people through the story you're preaching to be clear every step of the way. You don't want them to fall out of the vehicle in the tour of the text. You want to make sure that they see and know what is happening. Well, we'll probably stop here because we've covered a lot of ground on preaching narratives, looking at Genesis 22 as an example. And I hope this will be helpful to you as you work your way through the preaching of narratives. Now, before we close, I do want to suggest some other books to you. I've given you already recommended a couple of books to you. I want to recommend three more. I want to recommend to you Sidney Greidanus's book, Preaching Christ from the Old Testament. This is a very, very helpful tool. If you don't own this book, get it. It teaches you the proper hermeneutics for preaching the Old Testament. I want to recommend that book to you. I also want to recommend Walter Kaiser's book, Preaching and Teaching from the Old Testament. This is an excellent book. It takes all the genres of the Bible, shows you how to preach narratives, talks to you about how to preach the law, how to preach the prophets, how to preach the wisdom literature, the poetic literature. Again, an excellent work, which I highly recommend. And finally, a newer work written by Benjamin Walton called Preaching Old Testament Narratives. This is another work I think you really need in your library. In fact, there are a number of good books on preaching narratives, but the 5 works that I'm giving you are 5 of what I consider to be top in this field. There are other good ones. I'm not negating or neglecting others. I just don't have time to introduce all of them to you. But if you will add these 5 volumes to your library, you will preach Old Testament narratives well. And remember, 70% of the Bible is narratives. And so you need to learn how the technique and the skills that are necessary, the finesse that you need to preach Old Testament narratives. And so do that. Follow Paul's admonition in 2 Timothy 4, verse 2, preach the word.